What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode. Today I'm going to be showing you how to install a new axle on your car. So today I'm going to be working on the Volkswagen Golf again. The passenger side axle shaft, one of the boots is broken. And I was able to find one of these boots for $12 and the entire axle for $16. So call me stupid, guess which one I bought? As you can tell, I've got the axle right here, and that means I'm going to be showing you guys how to install it on the car. So in my last video, I showed you guys how to install the GTI brakes on the car. And I showed you basically how to take out almost everything on the front end. So I showed you how to take off the knuckle, the tie rod end, the suspension, the strut, basically everything. And today I'm going to show you a little bit more, and I'm going to go one step further into that disassembly. So if you can see right here, I've got the GTI brakes mounted on the car. You can see the larger brake caliper, larger rotor, larger everything, and it all fits. It works nicely. If we go to the passenger side, you can see that I still haven't mounted it up. And the reason being is that I took off the old brakes that were attached to the knuckle and I swapped it with the new ones. So because the price of replacement parts has gone down so much to the point that it's not really even worth it to fix something, it's easier to replace the entire thing. So the axle that I've got behind me, the one that's broken, needs to be essentially all replaced. But the boot costs $2 less than the entire shaft, and the shaft comes with 2 new boots and is a brand new axle. So why would you not replace the whole thing while you're at it? So what we're seeing right here is this part. So we've got this end right here that connects to the hub and the spindle, and that makes the wheels turn. So we've got the wheel that attaches on this side and the transmission that connects on this. So on this end, we've got the engine, the transmission, and the differential. But on a front wheel drive car, we have this thing called a transaxle. So because it's front engine, front wheel drive, the transaxle is essentially the transmission and the differential built into one. So out of the one side, we've got the passenger axle, and on the other side, we've got the driver's side axle. There is no transmission and differential. They're not two different things. They're basically all built into one. If you have a pickup truck or a sports car that's rear wheel drive, the engine is going to be in the front, the transmission is going to be in front of the rear wheels, and you're going to have a drive shaft that connects from your transmission to your differential. And after the differential, it's going to branch off into your 2 axles. That's essentially what we're changing today. So it's actually going to be quite simple as to how we take it out. So there's essentially only 6 bolts that are holding the drive shaft up to the differential. So the disassembly today is actually going to be quite easy. If you want to see how I took apart all of this, I'll send you a link to my other video. But today I'm just going to focus on the axle shaft. So this right here is the half shaft, the axle shaft, or the axle. There's so many different names for it. It's all essentially the same thing. So we're going to be replacing this, and it's going to be quite easy on how we take it out. On the back side of it, there's 6 bolts that we need to remove so that we can take out and replace this axle. So if we're on the passenger side wheel well right now, if we go down and under, you're going to be able to see the transaxle and the axle coming out right there. So you can see that there's 6 bolts that we're going to have to remove in order for us to change this out. Now can you see each one of those little screws? Each one of those screws is not a hex. It's not a Torx, it's this very strange Volkswagen tool, and I'm going to show you it right now. So these are those tools that I was talking about. If you take a look at them, it looks very similar to a Torx, but instead of only having 6 points, it's got 12. There's many different names for these tools. I'll have a link for it in the description, so if you guys ever have to come across this type of tool or socket, I'll have some in the description, you guys can buy some. But if we take a look at one, you can see that it's not quite a 6 point like a Torx. If you get a close-up on it, you can see that it's got 12 points to it. It's similar, but a Torx won't get you by here. One of the names that I've heard is a triple bit square socket. And that's essentially what we're going to need to do to take out each one of those bolts that are mating the axle to the transaxle. Now I'm just going to let you guys know something. Before you go underneath the car and start working, get some goggles, glasses, something, because you know, as soon as you start working underneath there, something is guaranteed gonna fall into your eye. Now don't ask me how I know that, but just take my word on it. So this is how I've been getting it to work. I attach this really long extension with the bit attached at the end to my impact gun, and I've been taking out the sockets, like each one of the little screws, through here. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see those little bolts that are around the outside of the ripped boot. Those are what I've been trying to take off. And each one of them is kind of manageable if you push the boot out of the way. And by using the little extension that I have right here, or should I say big extension, I've been able to get access to those bolts and loosen them up one by one. After we've gone ahead and loosened every one of them up, don't turn the axle anymore. All you have to do next is support the axle from falling to the ground when we remove the other bolts, and then we can proceed to take it off the transmission. Given the area that we're working on, it's very difficult to get in there with a set of ratchets, only because the boot is in a very hard to reach place and there's a lot of stuff that's in the way. So that's why I use the extension on my impact gun to break the bolts loose. Now after I did that for every one of the bolts, I didn't take them out yet. I then grabbed an impact wrench with the same extension and I attached it on the end and removed then each and every one of those screws. By giving the axle shaft a little tug, you should be able to remove it from the car so that we can install the new one back on there. Now before we install it, you can tell that right now we've got the old one on the bottom and the new one on top. Now it's very important when you're installing these to make sure that they're the exact same thing. So you can see that we've got the little part on the left, you got your bolts, the boot, the axle that travels all the way over to this side, and you can see we have the other CV boot, and it goes right up here to the splines on each side. Now this one is covered. If you take that out, you can see that they're the same thing. Now the reason why we're changing this one is because this boot is torn. As you can see there, that's the new one. That one's in perfect condition, and this one's torn. When you take this out, you can see that all the grease and everything is exposed. Right there. Now this still will pass a safety. This is not working in the way it was designed. So you have to make sure that when you're installing the new one on the car, not to tear it and to be careful. Now on the old axle here, you can see how well greased up everything is in there. And in the new one, it's not greased. But when you buy it, it should come with a new pack, and you have to insert all of this into not only the boot, but all in here so that everything gets lubricated properly and doesn't fail on you. So the end that connects up to the transmission right here, in the boot, there's not that much grease in there, and that's because of just the way that they ship the piece. So when you buy another one of these axles, it should include new grease so you can repack all of the stuff. So you just have to find an opening for it, and basically pump in all this grease into the boot. This way, all of this is going to be able to spin and move freely without any metal to metal contact. So get a pair of scissors and open up the new pack of grease. And then go ahead and open this up as much as you can and just pump this full of grease. Now when you're putting this in, you want to try and disperse this as evenly as you can, just so that everything gets basically all the same amount of lubrication. And make sure that when you're doing this, you use the entire pack. So just get it and squeeze in as much as you can. Pretend this is some toothpaste and you're trying to get the last little bit out of it. So just get it, squeeze it up as much as you can. The better of a job that you do to lubricate this, the longer this part will last. And then you want to make sure that you get a little bit on this side too. Now that the internals of the axle are well lubricated, we can then go ahead and mount it up to the transaxle and put those 6 bolts into the axle where they belong. So now that the axle is lined up to the end of the transaxle, you can then grab your hex, your triple square sockets or whatever it is, and screw them into the transaxle so that it's mounted properly. Now before you tighten them all up very tight, you want to first tighten them all up to the end by hand as hard as you can, and then after that, tighten them up a little bit more. Only at that point, the axle is going to be mounted and mated properly to the transaxle, and that way you won't have any oscillations or vibrations as soon as you start driving down the road. Now that each one of those bolts is now in there hand tight, I'm going to grab the ratchet and tighten them up for good. When you're tightening up these bolts, make sure that you don't use an impact gun because these bolts aren't torqued that strong onto the transaxle. They're only tightened up to 59 foot-pounds of torque. So if you don't have a torque wrench, just grab your 1/2-inch ratchet and tighten up these bolts as much as you can by hand, and only that. Don't try and get any more leverage because as soon as you go more than 59 foot-pounds, you're going to be putting too much torque on there and you have the risk of breaking the bolts and the splines that are on the back side of the transaxle. If those break and snap, you're going to be in a huge mess. You can then proceed to install the knuckle back onto the car and feed the axle through it. Now make sure that the nut is only hand tight because we're going to tighten it up properly later. Now if you took the strut out for any reason, make sure you put it back in here at this time. After that, install the entire knuckle assembly back into the lower control arm through the ball joint. Then install the outer tie rod end, any electrical harnesses that we removed from the strut, the brake rotor, and finally the brake caliper. Now don't forget too that when you're installing all this back together, to bleed the braking system so you don't have any air pockets in your brake lines. Now if you're wondering why this section here is a little different than the footage from before, it's because my memory card filled up and it didn't record this part. But I'm going to do it again in the exact same way that I did before. After you go ahead and install everything back on the car, so all the suspension and including the wheel, don't put the center cap back on the wheel yet. And the reason being is we have to tighten this up to a certain torque spec so that the axle is mounted properly. So to tighten up that little bolt right in the middle, we have to torque it down properly. Now if I grab my hand, I go behind here and grab onto the axle, you can see that there's a little bit of play, which means that this isn't tight. When the axle nut is loose, there's going to be a little bit of play in the axle. Now when you tighten it up properly, there shouldn't be any movement whatsoever. So there's a specific way that you tighten up the CV axle with the CV nut. So this bolt is going to have to first initially be torqued to 148 foot-pounds of torque. So to do that, get your hand from the back side, grab onto the axle, and push it through just so you have enough room for the nut to thread onto the axle. As soon as you get it started, you've got it screwed on like that. Grab your 30mm socket and your ratchet or breaker bar and tighten this up until you get a little bit of traction, until it starts to get a little firm. So now that I'm at this point right here, I just tightened it up until the wheel is spinning. So right now, I'm going to take the socket off of my ratchet and then switch over to my torque wrench. Put that on there. And now to make sure that we can tighten this up properly, you're going to have to lower the car slightly onto the ground so that the wheel won't spin. So get the car, twist your jack a little bit, and you just need it enough so that when you apply a little bit of movement and pressure on it, it's not going to turn on you. The next step is going to be grabbing your torque wrench with your socket on it, mount it on the axle, and then tighten this until you get to the proper specification. So for this Golf that I'm working on today, it's 148 foot-pounds of torque. If you don't know what yours is, you can check your service manual and it'll tell you all the details in there. So grab your torque wrench and tighten it until you hear a click. You might have to get up for this and put a little bit more pressure, only because it's a decent amount of torque. You hear that click? As soon as you hear that, you know that this is tightened properly. So take this off, get your socket, put it back on your breaker bar, set it so it loosens instead of tightens, grab the socket, and you're going to turn this counterclockwise half a turn. Like that, half a turn, take it off, grab your jack and lift the car in the air. We then need to turn the wheel 180 degrees, so it doesn't matter which way you do it. 180 degrees. Get the car, put it back down on the ground. And then finally, tighten this up to 37 foot-pounds of torque. So get your torque wrench and bring it down. 37 foot-pounds. Get your socket. Put it on the torque wrench. And then tighten the nut in here until you hear the click. Once it's tightened to the 37 foot-pounds and you hear the click, you then need to turn this an additional 1/6 of a turn. So say we're going to start off here at 12, you're going to want to bring it to 2 o'clock. So there's 12, bring it to 2. There. Now it's completely tightened up. Now I'll be including the torque specs for this vehicle in the description below, so if you have a Golf, you'll be lucky enough to have all the figures that you need without having to go anywhere. But if you have a different car, if you look up in the owner's manual or even go to your local dealership, they'll be happy to help you out with the torque figures so that you can install all of the stuff properly on the vehicle. If you guys have any questions regarding the video, throw them down in the comment section below and I'd be happy to help. Again, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Yeah, I still have something stuck under there, but yeah, we'll figure it out. But yeah, get some. It's definitely worth it.